What's up, guys? So we played another game with the black pieces against Constantine Seguin from Ecuador, 1959. He opens with 1d4, and we play knight of 6. He goes c4, and we play the Budapest Gambit with e5. So he takes, which is the main move. We go to knight g4, trying to win back our pawn. He goes e3, just developing. I take back the pawn. So now material's even. And white moved 2 pawns. I have a minor piece out. It's a little weird for black. It's a very weird opening. I'll tell you that much. He goes knight h3, which looks funny, but is theory, because if he goes to f3, it gives me a free trade at any moment. Um, like I'll double my knights or whatever, and my knight is justified here on e5. But a lot of times white plays f4, kicking my knight out of the center, and it becomes very awkward. So why let me stabilize and justify my knight instead of making it awkward? So this is a move. So I develop as fast as I can. So that means giving a check with the bishop. He blocks. Now I use this chance to play a5, which helps control the b4 square another time. It also prepares this rook lift. And having this pawn here also helps control this square, the c5 square, in case a knight ever gets there, because the pawn helps defend it. So anyway, I play a5, defending my bishop. He attacks my bishop, so now I want to move with tempo. So I take his bishop, he takes back. Now it's my turn. Now there's lots of sensible moves. Castling, d6, opening up my bishop, um, developing my queen does knight even. So I castle, standard enough. He develops. Everything makes perfect sense. And so again, I have options. I can develop my knight to c6. I can play d6. Maybe even move my rook over to e8. Just moves I know I'm going to want to make, moves that are nice and healthy developing moves. But instead I go a little dubious route, a different developing move, which is an idea in the Budapest. Rook to a6. A very early rook lift, with the idea of just swinging it to the king side and having an extra piece that you normally don't have when you play games. So he develops his bishop to its best square, so I don't get to take it. I swing my rook over. I again don't have to. I can develop my pieces. Um, I can attack this pawn even, but I can go to g6. I go to h6. He doesn't have a dark square bishop, so can't get hit that way. It can kind of get pawn stormed, maybe. It's a bit dubious, but I wanted to move my rook to the king side before I played d6 and cut off the access. That's why I moved it so early. That was the idea. Because even though d6 is probably a better move, it would, you know, not give me this rook left option. So if white is super accurate, it's a slightly dubious, but if he's not super accurate, you got an extra piece on the king side. So he goes knight to f4. Logical developing move. Now he's ready to castle. All of his pieces are out. I'm already castled, and I have 2 minors, which I'm going to bring out. No big deal. So here, lots of healthy moves. D6, knight out to one of these squares. That all looks reasonable. D6 I played, defending the knight, opening up this bishop. This bishop is very powerful in its starting square. So he moves his rook to get better control. He has a lot of control of the d5 square, 4 pieces for him to use as a jumping off point. Mm, Also, you'll notice that in all these Budapest lines, because he starts with d4, c4, there's always a pawn here blocking the bishop from coming here. Not that it could anyway, but so you don't have that pressure down this diagonal, um, which is nice. So I developed my knight. Now you definitely can go this way, this way. I just go this way because it gives me the option to go to these squares, and I want it to be on that circuit as opposed to this circuit, um, because I like this square. And this square also gives me access, the c5 square gives me access to b3 as well as e6. And I really like knights on e6 and d6. I think it's a cool spot, even more centralized than their natural squares, just harder to get to. Okay, so knight d7, developing move. He plugs a knight in here. It's not currently doing anything, um, but I say, you know what? This is his strong square. This is white's, like, I guess, his type of outpost. So I'm just going to immediately kick it because it's not an actual outpost. And so I play c6. And what this does, oh, I should also mention that by moving the knight in the center, it opens up this diagonal. So you always have to make observations of your opponent's moves. And you ask yourself 2 questions. One, um, what does that move threaten? In this case, you would look and say, okay, it threatens the pawn, and it just threatens centralization. And then the second question is, what are the drawbacks or consequences of that move? For example, the knight no longer defends these squares in case that mattered, in case you could take advantage. So anyway, he moves the knight. One of the threats is he attacks the pawn. So I want to kick this knight and defend the pawn. So I play c6, so the queen defends the pawn and kicks the knight. The downside of this move is it weakens the d6 pawn. It becomes kind of backwards because it doesn't have a support, and he already has 2 heavy pieces aiming at it. But I made the call anyway, saying if he doesn't have use of the d5 square, I think that's a bigger. I get more value from that than he'll get from d6 being a weakness. Also, because the d6, the queen's right here, protecting it, and even this weird rook on h6 is protecting it. And I can easily add defenders, so I felt like. And he also has the queen in front, so he can never take as long as there's a lesser value piece. So anyway, he goes back, because where else? Now in this position, um, black has some moves. He can still just develop these knights to open up the bishop and get it fully developed. But I saw that this pawn is weak, and if he attacks with the heavy pieces, it's not a big deal. It could be a big deal if he attacks it with a knight, because knight's a low value piece, and I'll have trouble defending it. So I saw that this knight was kind of garbage, because this doesn't have a circuit. These are taken. His only real activity potential is here, which aside from just being a centralized square, happens to come with the threat of knight takes d6, and that would be annoying. You can still allow it, but I didn't really see a reason to. And so to limit his activity, take away this square, I went f5. And this also opens up my other rook. I'm not worried about this diagonal, especially with the pawn here, almost protecting me. Um, and now I just have space for my army. And now this knight is worth a lot less, I feel like. And these seem like pretty good squares to take control of. I like the move. So now he brings his queen into the center, and I'm not really sure why. Centralization is good generally, but with the queen in such like a weird position, it doesn't threaten anything. It's also not accessing any new squares except for a7, which doesn't matter. So I'm not sure about this move or why, what the point of it is. I'm not sure. So I'm gonna play just normal moves. I need to finish developing. So I move my knight to c5 because I think these knights look really nice here. Centralized, hitting the light squares together. Also now I have access to b3, to b3, which is annoying because it hits the queen, as well as this. So I can plop a knight back here, hit the queen and the knight, and then park my bishop here. And I think my position looks, got to be careful about this pawn, but my position looks really nice. So I guess he was afraid of these moves just like, hitting the queen. So he goes back, but it still can hit the queen. So I'm not sure what the point of this was, but I didn't care because he's wasting moves and I'm get free development. I could have gone knight to e6. Oh no, I couldn't have because this pawn hangs. Or maybe it doesn't. He gets a pawn, I get a knight, he gets a queen. I get a pawn, he goes over. Yeah, that doesn't work for black at all. Okay, so I guess I didn't have this option this turn because this would hang. And queen e7 makes a lot of sense here. I feel like the queen on e7 is a super coordinated, super coordinator, coordinating the entire army of black, like a general from his outpost, and that still allows full freedom for rooks and bishops. It acts as a replacement dark square bishop, also enabling more defense of this pawn in case it's necessary. Queen f6 even is a nice move. Also g5, because this knight, if it goes here, that's hilarious. If it goes here, you win a pawn. So g5 in this position is possible, but I didn't play it. I didn't even see it. Hmm. It's an interesting move. All my squares are covered. g5. It doesn't. He's not castled yet, but it doesn't look like a weakness. Instead, I made a bad move, which was queen g5, which is just dumb because it doesn't come with a threat because this knight defends this. Like it doesn't make any sense. I obviously want to play g5 to destabilize this knight. I don't know why queen g5. Yeah, this move doesn't make much sense to me. In hindsight, I would much rather have it on e7 and play g5. But okay, I make a mistake. He goes h4. And I think this is also what I miscalculated before I played queen to g5. I thought that if I thought he couldn't play h4 because I can take with my rook, and if he takes, I take, and now my queen's in like this cool spot where I can give a check. But in reality, if I take the pawn and he takes my rook and I take his rook, he can just come in with the queen, taking my d6 pawn, destabilizing both knights, breaking my into my position. And even if I give this check, it doesn't do anything. He can block with the bishop. He can probably even move his king to the other side, and I'm completely lost probably. So I didn't see that. So once he did this, I then saw it, and I'm like, oh shoot, I can't take that pawn. And then I go to where I should have gone to begin with, e7 square, perfect coordinating square. But I wasted tempi. I gave him moves. Arguable if this is good for him or me, but still. So he goes b4 because he doesn't really see a plan here for himself because it's hard to, you don't want to open your own king up. So he feels like he can't play in the center, he can't play in the king side. He feels like he has to play on the queen side, and this looks like a pawn push that's possible, right? Does it do much? No, but it's possible. So he does it. We trade. Now my knight's hit. It's got to go somewhere. fine. I jump it into the center, two beautiful stack knights, and this hits the queen. It also hits the knight and puts pressure on some dark squares. And I figured when I made this move that, okay, great, my knights are great, my position's good. Um, he's not going to take, and his queen's under attack, so he'll move his queen somewhere, and then I'll get another tempo to develop. Or oh no, that's what my plan was. My plan was he was going to move the queen, and I was going to go g5, and he can't take because his rook's hanging. And if he moves the knight, well, that's just awesome for me and my kingside attack, and it's all going to go downhill for him. But he took, and I was happy. I didn't think he was going to take, and I was happy he took because now I get to recapture this pawn, stifling these light squares for his bishop. Also, potential jumping off point in coordination with my knight for some weird tactic in the down the line. Also, it opened up my rook right towards this pawn pressure. Also opened up my bishop, which was hitting the pawn before. So I was like, okay, this works. So I took back. He tries to get some activity, and as you've noticed, he hasn't castled the entire game because he feels like he'll be castling into death. So he goes this way, queen to a2. And now it's not really doing anything here. Infiltration-wise, it has no targets. The only idea it looks like is to set up this discovered pawn push, like which doesn't do anything. Not to mention I can just put my bishop here. Before or after I play g5, I could put my rook here, I could move my king over. If he pushes the pawn, I can push and block everything. This move is completely useless, so I'm happy to see it. But as far as useful moves for white, I wouldn't know what to suggest. He just looks really bad. So in this position, why didn't I go g5? g5, knight has to move, and there's no immediate threat except winning the pawn. So I prepped it with queen f6. My plan was to now push, on my next turn, push g5. He can't take the pawn because his rook hangs with check. And if he moves the knight, now I have two attackers on this f2 pawn. And if that falls, he's just in giant trouble. I guess he could go here to try to defend it, but then you just take with the bishop and take anyway, and then he's lost. So I thought that queen f6 was nice. It just comes with a huge threat. That's how do you deal with it? So now this guy thought he was cheeky. So he noticed that this pawn is no longer defended by the rook, or it is, but the queen's in the way. So he came up with a tactic with a minute and 50 on his clock to take the pawn, forcing queen takes. All right, picture this: rook takes, queen takes. Now my queen is here. Then he gets to push the pawn with a check, hitting my queen and winning my queen for the rook. So he was happy, he thrilled. So what does he do? He takes. So what do? I take. But aren't I walking directly into his trap? That's the question. Yes, that's the answer. I walk into it, but I had already calculated with a minute on my clock that I'm just going to be up material after I win his queen. So I chuck my bishop in here saying, okay, if you take my queen, I'll take your queen, and you just gave me a rook. So you can't do that. And if you take my bishop, I'll just take your queen, so you can't do that. So what does he do? He takes my bishop with the knight, right? I can't recapture with the rook because I lose my queen. So what just happened? He took the bishop, I took a knight, but he gave up a rook. So I'm up an entire rook here. I'm just going to go back so you can see that, right? So if material's even, he gets a pawn but loses a rook. So he's down a rook. I block. He gets a piece. I get a piece. He's still down a rook for a pawn. So now his queen was a hit. He doesn't want to trade. He just goes to some random square that avoids the trade. It's over. I'm completely winning. Um, there's nothing left here. So I just give him a check because it hits this square again. So he can't move it. He basically has to take, right? Um, so he takes, which trades off more material. I'm up a rook, so I want to end the game. So that's why I do this. Now it's his turn. And he resigns because he should. And that was a nice game. Played almost perfectly. If I do the game review, 90%, 2400 rating. The early rook lift is a bit dubious. D6 is probably, it's definitely more solid, but not as fun. I'm not sure the rook did much. Let's see. What did it do from here on out? Didn't move. I guess it did serve a function, which was it pressured this H pawn, whether it was on H2 or H4. It pressured it the entire time, also discouraging him from castling into it because at any moment, if he castled, the queen would have went to H4 lining up. Um, so it did have its influence here. Did have its influence. Even though the game is level, I would definitely prefer black here. Um, it just looks a lot easier to play. And this, yeah, and the rook, you can see the rook here was pivotal in defense as well for all of this, for this pawn, this entire time that was weak. It was absolutely necessary. If it was on A8, you couldn't have done any of this, and none of this would even work. You would have had to play a completely different game. Yeah. Okay, so that rook was super important. All right, so we win 1977. That's a good game with the Budapest Gambit. We'll keep going.